As long as the historical threat came at it from the real, power played at the turns and simulation, disintegrating all the contradictions by dint of producing equivalent signs. Today, when the danger comes at it from simulation, that of being resolved in the play of signs, power plays at the real, plays at crisis, plays at remanufacturing artificial social, economic, and political stakes. For power, it is a question of life and death, but it is too late. Whence the characteristic hysteria of our times, that of the production and reproduction of the real, the other production that of values and commodities, that of the belle epoch of political economy, has for a long time had no specific meaning. What every society looks for in continuing to produce and to overproduce is to restore the real it escapes. This is why today this material production of the hyperreal itself retains all the features, the whole discourse of traditional production, but it is no longer anything but its scaled down refraction. Thus hyperrealists fix a real from which all meaning and charm, all depth and energy of representation have vanished in a hallucinatory resemblance. Thus everywhere the hyperrealism of simulation is translated by the hallucinatory resemblance of the real to itself. Power itself has for a long time produced nothing but the signs of its resemblance, and at the same time another figure of power comes into play, that of a collective demand for signs of power, a holy union that is reconstructed around its disappearance. The whole world adheres to it more or less in terror of the collapse of the political, and in the end the game of power becomes nothing but a critical obsession with power, obsession with its death, obsession with its survival, which increases as it disappears. When it has totally disappeared, we will logically be under the total hallucination of power, a haunting memory that is already in evidence everywhere, expressing at once the compulsion to get rid of it. No one wants it anymore. Everyone unloads it on everyone else, and the panic nostalgia over its loss. The melancholy of societies without power, this has already stirred up fascism, the overdose of a strong referential in a society that cannot terminate its mourning. With the extenuation of the political sphere, the president comes increasingly to resemble that puppet of power, who is the head of primitive societies. All previous presidents pay for and continue to pay for Kennedy's murder as if they were the ones who had suppressed it, which is true phantasmagically, if not in fact. They must efface this defect and this complicity with their simulated murder, because now it can only be simulated. Presidents Johnson and Ford were both the object of failed assassination attempts, which, if they were not staged, were at least perpetrated by simulation. The Kennedys died because they incarnated something, a political substance, whereas the new presidents are nothing but caricatures and fake film. Curiously, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, all of this seeming mug, the monkeys of power. Death is never an absolute criterion, but in this case it is significant. The era of James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, and the Kennedys, of those who really died simply because they had a mythical dimension that implies death, not for romantic reasons, but because of the fundamental principle of reversal and exchange. This era is long gone. It is now the era of murder by simulation, of the generalized aesthetic of simulation, of the murder alibi, the allegorical resurrection of death, which only there is to sanction the institution of power, without it which it no longer has any substance or autonomous reality. The staged presidential assassinations are revealing because they signal the status of all negativity in the West, political opposition, the left, critical discourse, etc., a simulacral contrast through which power attempts to break the vicious cycle of its non-existence, of its fundamental irresponsibility, of its suspension. Power floats like money, like language, like theory. Criticism and negativity alone still secrete a phantom of the reality of power. If they become weak for one reason or another, power has no other recourse but to artificially revive and hallucinate them. It is in this way that the Spanish executions still serve as a stimulant to Western liberal democracy, to a dying system of democratic values. Fresh blood, but for how much longer? The deterioration of all power is irresistibly pursued. It is not so much the revolutionary forces that accelerate this process. Often it is quite the opposite. It is the system itself that deploys against its own structures this violence that annuls all substance and all finality. One must not resist this process by trying to confront the system and destroy it, because this system that is dying from being disposed of its death expects nothing but that from us, that we give the system back its death, that we revive it through the negative. End of revolutionary praxis, end of the dialogue. Curiously, Nixon, who was not even found worthy of dying at the hands of the most insignificant, chanced, unbalanced person, and through it's perhaps true that presidents are assassinated by unbalanced type, this changes nothing. The leftist penchant for detecting a righteous conspiracy between this brings out a false problem, the function of bringing death to, or the prophecy, etc., against power has always been fulfilled, from primitive societies to the present, by demented people, crazy people, or neutral neurotics, who nonetheless carry out a social function as fundamental as that of presidents, was nonetheless ritually put to death by Watergate. Watergate is still a mechanism for the ritual murder of power. The American institution of the presidency is much more thrilling in this regard than the European. It surrounds itself with all the violence and vicissitudes of primitive powers, of savage rituals, but already impeachment is no longer assassination. It happens via the Constitution. Nixon has nevertheless arrived at the goal of which all power dreams, to be taken seriously enough, to constitute a mortal enough danger to the group to be one day relieved of its duties, denounced and liquidated. Ford doesn't even have the opportunity anymore. The simulacrum of an already dead power can only accumulate against himself the signs of reversion through murder. In fact, he is immunized by his impotence, which infuriates him. In contrast to the primitive right, which foresees the official and sacrificial death of the king or the chief is nothing without promise of his sacrifice. The modern political imaginary goes increasingly in the direction of delaying, of concealing for as long as possible, the death of the head of state. This obsession has accumulated since the era of revolutions and the charismatic leaders. Hitler, Franco, Mao, having no legitimate heirs, no affiliation with power, see themselves forced to perpetuate themselves indefinitely. Popular myth never wishes to believe them dead. The pharaohs already did this. It was always one and the same person who incarnated the successful pharaohs. Everything happens as if Mao or Franco had already died several times and had been replaced by his double. From a political point of view, that a head of state remains the same or is someone else doesn't strictly change anything, so long as they resemble each other. For a long time now, a head of state, no matter which one, is nothing but the simulacrum of himself, and only that gives him the power and quality to govern. No one would grant the least consent, the least devotion to a real person. It is to his double, he being already dead, to which allegiance is given. This myth does nothing but translate the persistence, and at the same time the deception, of the necessity of the king's sacrificial death. We are still in the same boat. No society knows how to mourn the real power, the social itself, which is implicated in the same loss. It is through an artificial revitalization of all this that we try to escape this fact. This situation will no doubt end up giving rise to socialism, through an unforeseen turn of events and via an irony that is no longer that of history. It is from the death of the social that socialism will emerge, as it is from the death of God that religions emerge. a twisted advent, a perverse event, an unintelligible reversion to the logic of reason, as is the fact that power is in essence no longer present except to conceal that there is no more power, a simulation that can last indefinitely because, as distinction from true power, which is or was a structure, a strategy, a relation of force, a stake, it is nothing but the object of a social demand, and thus, as the object of the law supply and demand, it is no longer subject to violence and death, completely purged of a political dimension. It, like any other commodity, is dependent on mass production and consumption. Its spark has disappeared. Only the fiction of a political universe remains. The same holds true for work. The spark of production, the violence of its stakes no longer exist. The whole world still produces, and increasingly, but subtly work has become something else, a need, as Marx ideally envisioned it, but not in the same sense, the object of a social demand, like leisure, to which it is equivalent in the course of everyday life, demand exactly proportional to the loss of a stake in the work process. Same change in fortune as is for power. The scenario of work, there is no conceal of the real of work. The real of production has disappeared. The real of the strike as well, which is no longer a work stoppage, but its alternate pole in the ritual scanation of the social calendar. Everything occurs as if each person had, after declaring a strike, occupied his place and workstation and recommenced production, as it is the norm in a self-managed occupation, exactly in the same terms as before, all while declaring himself and virtually being permanently on strike. This is not a dream out of science fiction. Everywhere it is a question of doubling the process of work, and of a doubling the process of going on strike, striking incorporated just as obsolescence is in objects, just as crisis is in production. So there is no longer striking nor work, but both simultaneously, that is to say something else, a magic of work, a trompe-l'oeil, a cinematic drama, a scenodrama, that is not to say a melodrama of production, a collective dramaturgy on the empty stage of the social. It is no longer a question of the ideology of work, the traditional ethic that would obscure the real process of work and the objective process of exploitation, but of the scenario of work. In the same way, it is no longer a question of the ideology of power, but of the scenario of power. Ideology only corresponds to a corruption of reality through signs. Simulation corresponds to a short circuit of reality and to its duplication through signs. It is always the goal of the ideological analysis to restore the objective process. It is always a false problem to wish to restore the truth beneath the simulacra. This is why, in the end, power is so much in tune with ideological discourses and discourses of ideology, that they are discourses of truth, always good for countering the mortal blows of simulation, even and especially if they are revolutionary.